I love to tell this story. It was a rallying cry for missionaries, and Susan would have sung this really throughout the United States and also during her time in Africa. And I think it's appropriate that we sang that today because in your own way, all of you are missionaries representing our church in various ways and in various places. Now, I first heard about Susan Colllins when I was a young child, and I was attending services here, but in the old building. And one day I looked up and saw this bright star in the sanctuary to the right side above the lectern, and I asked my mother, "What is that light up there for? What is that star up there for?" And she said, "Well, that's Susan's star." But I had no idea at that point who Susan was, and frankly I kind of forgot about it, went away to college and everything. But then about 15 years ago, I was back visiting Mom, and Merle Sternberg said to me like this, "Jan, I have a project for you when you retire." And I said, "Oh, tell me a little bit about it." And I gave it some thought. And so about 10 years ago when I was back, I started researching Susan Angeline Colllins. And I thought I would be fortunate if I found enough information to perhaps write 10 to 15 pages about her. I've now written over 300 pages, and it's getting, I would say my draft is done, and I'm now searching for a publisher. So I would like to share now just a few of the things I found about this woman who had such an indomitable spirit. And as you can see, the span of her life was 1851 until 1940. And I've divided my presentation into 4 segments. First, her birth and life until 1882, and then going into 1882 when she went to South Dakota, and then later to Chicago. Her missionary years spanned from 1887. Can you hear me okay?
It's hard to hear in the back.
Oh, so.
I think if we turn this fan off here, it's making a lot of noise.
I was afraid if I got too close, I'd be pounding here.
Is that better?
Can you hear me better now? I'm sorry about that.
We don't want to miss anything.
I know. If I hold it really close, I get kind of a reverberating. Is that better? Oh, okay. Is it okay now? Thank you. I'm sorry. So then I'll go into talking about her missionary years, particularly northeast of St. Louis. And her parents were Sarah Joyner Collins and Isaac Collins. And they had both been freed from their indenture before Susan was born. And she had 3 older sisters and 3 younger brothers. So she was truly a middle child. And the children were born between 1844 and 1867. And then by 1858, the family had moved to Wisconsin, and they were near the Dells. And at that time, they had a small farm, and there were a few other African-American families living there. In 1864, in July, her father, Isaac, enlisted in a military unit, an infantry unit in Wisconsin. And he served in that unit as an undercook until the end of the war, and he was mustered out in 1865. And in my studying, I've learned that being an undercook was a typical role for African Americans in units that contained both blacks and whites. And by mid-November, the family had moved from the Dells area to Fayette, and they lived northeast of Fayette near Lima and Albany. And it was here it said that Isaac worked for Peter Bass for a number of years. And the Basses were among the black pioneer families in Fayette County. And at one time, there was a colony of about 122 blacks in the area. And my husband and I, a few years ago, went exploring because Isaac had purchased some acreage in what is now the Boggle Lake Recreation Area. He bought 16.5 acres and had his own little farm. We couldn't find any remains of any foundations of the farmstead, but it was fun walking that land. And those early settlers built a stone church. And some of us were talking before I started about all the limestone in the area. And they used native limestone, and that church was located just across Highway 150 from Pleasant View Cemetery. And can't find any remains of it. Vera Step Splinter and I walked that land trying to find something, but nothing was visible. Anyway, I believe that Susan and her younger siblings attended that school, and later it became integrated with white students. And that school closed in 1920 when we formed the Fayette Consolidated School District. And I'm going to put out a plea right now. If any of you have any pictures of that stone schoolhouse/church, I would really like to have one. I've only found a description of what it's like up in the Fayette County Historical Society meeting. So while Susan was here in Fayette and in her teens, she worked for various families. Most notably was the Jason Payne family. And as some of you know, he was one of the first graduates from Upper Iowa University. And she helped care for their 4 children, and later she worked at the Fayette House Hotel, which some of you may remember. But then she had to take a break between 1873 and 1877 to take care of her mother, her 2 older sisters, and her oldest brother, because they were all suffering from consumption, and they died between that time frame. So she lost a lot of her family in a very short time. And they're all buried out at the Lima Cemetery, just adjacent to Susan's burial site. And I think it was Reverend Payne who encouraged Susan to attend Upper Iowa. He obviously recognized that she was very bright and wanted her to have some opportunities. So I was able to find an old picture of College Hall and what I've been told it looked like at that time when Susan enrolled in a preparatory program in 1876. And there were no trees. It was just a lone building up here on the hill. And after she completed the preparatory program, she enrolled in the normal training program. It is said that she graduated from that or completed that in 1879. No proof has been found, simply because the records, part of the College Hall burned and the records were destroyed. But Susan was the first African-American woman or student to enroll at Upper Iowa. So now I'll move briefly into her Dakota Territory years. And this was in 1882 that she left. She took a train to Huron, Dakota Territory. It wasn't even a state. And this was part of the westward migration that she and many others joined. It's said that she went with other people from Fayette. I can't find who, and I won't go into all my searching. But that Native Americans had recently been moved west, and there was still occasional incidents actually in Huron. But why she went remains a mystery, and I'd really like to know why. So if anybody has clues, share. She was there for 3 years. She operated a laundry, had some adventures on these western plains. Most of the clients of her laundry were men who were building the town or the railroads to the west. And local lore has it that Susan staked a claim, but we could not find any records at the county recorder's office when we visited there in 2010. But during this time she was in the Dakota Territory, her thoughts about becoming a missionary had started. And one day, she got some laundry wrapped in a newspaper. And in that newspaper was an ad and an article about the Chicago Training School for city, home, and school missions, and also foreign missions. And she then started correspondence with Lucy Ryder Meyer. Is this okay? I just feel like I'm shouting too much. Okay, with Lucy Ryder Meyer, who started the training school. So by the fall of 1885, Susan was on a train from Huron to Chicago. She did stop in Fayette to see the Paynes and some of her Fayette friends and some of the women who were members of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society. And by then her father had died and he had married again and her stepmother was dead. So there was nothing to hold her back from pursuing her dream. And once again, a first. She was the first African American at the Chicago Training School. Now just think of this for a moment. What it would have been like for her to, start in Fayette, move to the plains of the Dakotas, to get on a train, go to Chicago, and she saw her first 10-story building, the first skyscraper built at that time, and the city was the fastest growing in the U.S. So from very few people to a dense population. Many of the people who were coming to Chicago were immigrants from Europe, from Asia, and Mexico, and they were living in inner city tenements. And the Chicago Training School curriculum helped deal with this, and I'll share a bit about that. They studied biblical, theological, and historical courses. They took nursing and some elementary medicine, which she used later, and I'll explain that. They did evangelistic, deaconess, and Sunday school work, and then they studied physical culture. And the students gained a lot of their practical experience working with these immigrant populations. And there was a lot of child labor issues. There were child labor issues they dealt with, and also poverty. And the curriculum contained 4 major pillars, and they were education, evangelism, industrial work, and healthcare. And those still occur today in missions around the world. And I got to see this last fall when I visited African University in Zimbabwe, and I just learned that the Iowa Conference is raising money for African University, and I'm so excited to hear that. So at the time Susan was going into missionary work, the women were really gaining more power, more recognition within the church. And another thing propelled her to go to Africa. The first bishop to Africa, William Taylor, visited the Chicago Training School just as Susan was completing her coursework. And this guy was tall, long, bushy-grained beard and flowing hair, and it would have been very difficult not to be swept away by him. And indeed, Susan was, and she joined his missionary team and departed for Africa in April 1887. Now, he was presumably impressed by her inquisitive nature, determination, deep religious belief, compassion, and her concentration to God. And then he had a model in mind, and this model she apparently fit was someone who could face difficulties, privation, hardship, and suffering at home, and have a patient, plodding, persevering, undaunted spirit. And it is said that Susan left for Africa with a hallelujah heart. So here she is. She's been traveling by steamship. And they left New York, went to Liverpool, England, and then to Lisbon, Portugal, and then south down to the Congo River area, which that's right here. And then she stayed in the Belgian Congo for about 2 years and lived primarily in the Delta area at a place called Banana Point. And that, of course, the Congo flows into the Atlantic. And another first, she was the first African-American woman to serve the Methodist Episcopal Church as a missionary in the Congo. And then from this location, she wrote a letter to a friend in Huron. And I'm going to share that with you because it gives a lot about the missionaries' attitudes during that time, and also how Susan felt about her work. So as I read, listen for the attitudes they had about the Africans, the challenges that missionaries faced, and a description of Susan's environment. The natives seemed glad to have us here. And this was written in January 1888. And they are very pleasant and ready to learn. What a need we have for missionaries here. Men, women, and children go around almost naked. Some of them wear nothing but a loincloth. They know but very little about good morals. The men have as many wives as they can afford to buy, and they are perfect slaves to their husbands. They will walk long distances with a child tied to their backs, going to the field to work, while the man lays around the house. Such is the heathen life here. Again, you get an idea of the attitudes the missionaries had at that time. The greatest drawback is that we can do little the first year because we must learn the language. There are only a few here who can understand English. I think I am getting along quite well toward learning the language. My health has been very good since I left home. Nearly everyone of the company that came out when I did has been sick of African fever, but I have not been sick a day yet, and I am very grateful for good health. Africa is a very beautiful country. We never have cold weather. The dry season, the hot season in the United States is the coldest season we have, but now it is midsummer. Gardens are beautiful, and corn is almost ready for the table. The wood is alive with the music of birds, and some of them are very pretty. I can hardly believe that it is January. So in the letters that I found over my research, health was frequently mentioned because it was a huge concern, and many of the missionaries died of malaria, African fever, or typhoid fever. And part of this was due to lowered resistance because their nutrition was lacking. They did not have many good food sources. But by mid-1888, Susan was traveling down. She was traveling down to Luanda, which is in Portugal. And at that point, Angola. But Angola was a Portuguese colony. And then she stayed there for a while, and here is a view of what Luanda looked at the time Susan was there. And during her stay, which was only a few weeks, she prepared for her journey inland. She began to learn Portuguese and Kimbundu. And Kimbundu was the local language spoken. And this slide shows you a picture of the mission station where she would have stayed. Now, soon after she left, after about a month, she went 220 miles inland. And I'll quickly show you a map of that, and I'll just point right here. Here's Luanda. She went down the Kuanza River, and then toward the center of the north part of Angola, and this is called the High Plateau region. And she was about 3,500 feet at elevation. And then I'm going to show you a bit of the modes of transportation. Those are the kinds of boats they traveled on. This is what it looked like along the river when you got out of the boat. And that was about 140 miles inland. After that, she had to walk on some very narrow, 15-inch wide caravan roads. And imagine that. I mean, these were on some mountains. You could easily go down. And when they weren't in the mountains, they were walking across plains that were dry and very hot. And they had to go through rough edge grasses on very uneven terrain. And sometimes they ended up crossing flooded streams. So you saw a picture of Susan. She was only about 5 foot tall, slightly built, and she was walking through all of this, well over 100 miles. And as I've read, I've learned that some of these trails were used to take captured indigenous people to Luanda to then get on ships to come to the Americas to serve as slaves. And I have wondered if Susan was aware of this, because very likely some of her ancestors were those slaves. And I've teased around a little bit. I said it would be interesting to dig up some of her bones and see if we could do a DNA on them, but I'm not going to go out there and do that. What'd you say, Boyle? So I was going to mention too, they do use carriers, and these gentlemen would carry between 60 to 75 pounds to get supplies to the interior. And they use that for the missionaries' work, for food supplies, later for carrying building materials and things of that nature. This is the approach to the first inland mission station where she was living for about 2 months, and it's called Pungo Ondango. And these are high black rocks, about 650 feet tall. In the foreground, you can see some of the fields that were cultivated by the male missionaries and their students, and the other missionaries in the foreground. And this is one of the mission stations there, so it gives you an idea of what it was like for her life, and again, very different from the Midwest. And here we are with Susan, with some of the children that she adored. And she started a school near Pungo Andongo after she'd been inland for a couple of years and bought the land and showed some real leadership skills, but that were very critical for her future and her life. The first 13 years that Susan was in the Congo and Angola, she had to survive under Bishop Taylor's self-sufficiency model. What this meant was they had to survive on whatever the local people provided, whatever they could grow in gardens or the fields, or whatever she could obtain from friends back at home. And Margaret Payne, wife of Reverend Jason Payne, would go around Fayette, I read, in a horse and buggy, collecting goods for Susan. So it was really a cooperative effort for them to survive. So in 1898, Bishop Taylor retired and made things a lot easier. The new bishop, Bishop Hartzell, he's visiting where she eventually ended up at Kweswa, and he realized that these missionaries could no longer survive under these extremely strenuous and difficult conditions. So he started letting them have furloughs, because she was there for 13 years living under those conditions. So in 1900, Susan came to the U.S., and she was 50, or nearly 50. And at that point, the men who were Methodist Episcopal officers thought that 50 was too old to go back. And here we all think 50 is a wonderful age, or most of us do. So anyway, they said that she couldn't go back because she didn't have a bachelor's degree. And Susan, being very tenacious, with that indomitable spirit, for some reason went to California, I think probably because that's where Bishop Taylor had retired, and she met the women of the Pacific branch of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society. And once they met her, they absolutely fell in love with her. They were impressed with her knowledge of Angola, her language skills. By then she was speaking Portuguese and Kimbundu with ease. She had a wonderful work ethic, and she loved the children. So they used funds, and they sponsored her for her last 18 years in Africa. So she got back there in January 1902, and then retired 18 years later. And in their letters I read that they wrote about her, they called her Our Dear Susan, Mother of our School, and many other laudatory things. And I'm briefly going to go through some of the roles that she had as a missionary. Number one, you can imagine, she was an evangelist. Secondly, she was a teacher, and she taught academic courses, she taught religious courses, and she taught some vocational education or industrial courses. Lots of gardening and things we would know as home ec. And then she was a nurse, and she nursed many of her sick colleagues. Most of them lived, but a few died. And then, of course, she was a mother to these girls, and sometimes she had 5, sometimes she was the only missionary, and she had 65 girls under her care. It's just amazing, and here she is. Now, by this time, she had a colleague, Martha Drummer from Atlanta, but Martha took furloughs, and Susan was left with all these girls. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, having those many kids to take care of? One admirer wrote of Susan, this is a quote, "The children of many homes will rise up and call her blessed because of the way their mothers were, as children, taught by her to love the Lord, thus becoming good homemakers." And of course she was a cook. Later she was a construction supervisor, helped build this house. And then even later, she supervised the building of this dormitory, along with everything else she did. And then we all know about reports in our jobs, and she had to do reports. She had to manage funds. She had to ask for funds, writing back for support, because she got her salary paid, but that didn't necessarily supply everything she needed. And then, oh, this is a better picture of Martha, Susan, and one of their students. But then, when the West African conference meetings were held, Susan and Martha were very often responsible for hosting all these people. And it's hard to see, and I know this is small, but Susan is in the middle, and Bishop Hartzell is over at the right. So those are some of her roles and responsibilities, and I'm briefly going to talk about challenges and hardships. And one of the challenges was when she got to Angola, and until 1914, there was still slavery there. And imagine how she must have felt. Like her parents were indentured servants, which we won't go into that. But anyway, it's a close call as to what their roles really were. Travel was very difficult, and here she is traveling by mule, but some of the missionaries rode oxen. Can you imagine bouncing around through this rough country on an ox? And later they had the chance to ride trains. And the train came from Luanda at the coast, about 220 miles in, to Kweswa and Malanje. But that didn't happen until 1910. And so that made it easier to get supplies. I've read that letters that Susan wrote probably took 3 months to reach the West Coast, and then of course the return time. They also had issues with safe water and protecting their food supply. And this shows how the African people protected their food supplies. They were stored up in these like cages up on the high poles. And they also had poor housing, and some of the houses you may have seen had thatched roofs, if you noticed the earlier slides I showed, and those were very dangerous because they would sometimes collapse during the rainy season. They had inadequate ventilation, termite infestations. I read one situation where a large termite mound was above the ceiling and in the dining room. Fortunately, the girls and the missionaries had just left. Big collapse. It was like over 200 pounds a mound. Can you imagine thinking, gotta watch out for this every day? And they didn't have good ventilation, which caused a lot of tuberculosis among the missionaries. But later on, this is the kind of house that Susan would have lived in. And there was always a shortage of missionaries because so many died, and it was very hard work. And Susan did not have a furlough between 1902 and 1920. And then, of course, they dealt with the native superstitions and their fetishes. And then there were still forced marriages. Girls from about 10 on up were married to older men, as I mentioned earlier, with many wives. But one of the female missionaries' greatest joys was when a Christian girl married a Christian man, and they started a Christian home. And a missionary wrote of Susan and Martha, "Thank God for the one bright spot at Kweswa, where a few girls may live clean lives and be trained up as Christian wives. Thank God, I say again, for the two noble women of Kweswa." And then, of course, they dealt with the flu epidemic in Angola, just as we did here during the same time period. Fortunately, Susan was rarely sick, and she was always writing in her notes how thankful she was that this rarely happened. Now, going on to her return to Iowa and then her final days. She was the Women's Society, the Women's Foreign Missionary Society was very much a pioneer in starting retirement programs for female missionaries, single female missionaries. They started this in 1914, and their plan was for missionaries to retire at the age of 67. But due to missionary shortages and furloughs, Susan worked there until she was 69. She was there during over half of her life, her adult life at that point. And she didn't want to leave, and according to a few things I've read, she kind of put up a big fuss about it, but they did send her back to the US. She actually wanted to be buried in Angola. During her retirement, she received about $220 per year. Previously, her salary had been about $500 per year, which I checked, and that was fairly equal to what a elementary school teacher would have been making at that time. But in 1905, when she had a regular salary, she sent money to Reverend Payne, and he purchased a house for her. Oops, sorry, I don't want to have that one yet. And she had to get a passport to get back home in 1920 due to the war. And when she got back here, she stayed with the Paynes, went to California to kind of reacclimate to the U.S., and then came back and moved into her house after the renter's lease was up. She did a lot of volunteer work in the community, like WCTU. She was very active in the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, spoke a lot about Africa, and often showed baskets and embroidery work of her students. And another thing I read about, and I know you can't see these very well, and you're welcome to come up and look, but these are porcupine quills. So during one of her meetings, she shared porcupine quills with all of the women in attendance. And they're much longer than our American porcupine quills, and if you want to look at them, I welcome you to come up and check them out. They're also very sharp. A former missionary colleague of Susan wrote, she was an education pioneer in Africa, and many people that she had more energy than people half her age. The girls loved her very much, and when she wrote to them after she was in Fayette, I read that they would read and reread her letters, and they would cry for their mother, Susan. So in 1935, Susan's housemate died, and she could no longer care for her home. So Margaret and Amy Lee Payne, the daughters of Margaret and Jason Payne, helped her move out to where the Graham Lewis farm was, and that's north of Fayette, off of 150. And there she lived with, and you'll know some of these names, some of you people, Harriet Graham Lewis, Julia Graham Stepp, and their brother Irwin. And here's a picture of the old United Methodist Church that stood on this spot, and some of you are familiar with that. And on Christmas Eve, 1937, Susan's star was dedicated, and it was right up in this area of the church that some of us who may remember that saw it. And the star was created by a local blacksmith with money that had been collected from all his Sunday school class students. And it was to commemorate Susan's 50th year since her departure for Africa. And at the conclusion of that program, on her African thumb piano, and this is one of her actual African thumb pianos that she gave to Reverend John D. Clinton. And this was given to the United Methodist Church here about 5 years ago when Reverend Clinton's daughter, June Clinton Rutt, brought it. And she played Jesus Loves Me, and we will be singing that soon. And that's why I selected that song. Just briefly, these are the locations where Susan lived. This is where her house is, and Joe Rody owns that house. It's at the corner of State and Alexander Streets. Just 1 block north of where we're sitting is where the Payne home was. And this is where she spent much of her time as both a visitor but also as a young worker. The Colllins property was out here, and then this area out here is where the Graham Lewis farm was. And in 1940, I wanted to show one more slide. This gentleman here is Bishop Oxen, who came from Omaha to meet Susan. He was so impressed with the stories that Reverend Clinton had told about her. And I think this Bible is the one she was holding in that picture. I found that digging through upstairs in the church one time I was back visiting. But in early 1940, Susan's health began to fail. And when women of the Women's Christian service heard of this, they began taking turns visiting the farm. On June 6th, she was reported very ill, and she died the next day, just 26 days shy of her 89th birthday. Her battle with cancer had ended, and she was buried out in the Lima Cemetery. As I've mentioned, she willed her house to the Pacific branch of the Women's Missionary Society, gave $100 to the Questwell Girls School, and some of the money she had that was left went for books for the Upper Iowa University Library. And I've seen some of those. Becky Wadian and I dug through the stacks one day and found them. And then a year after her death, the Payne sisters, Margaret and Amy Lee, used a portion of her estate's residual to purchase a baptismal font in her honor for this church. Fortunately, we don't know what happened to it when this structure was put up. And at the dedication of this font, Reverend Arthur Kindred said of Susan's life, and I think it's a nice summary of what she did. For a third of a century, she told the story of the Master, more through her life than through vocal eloquence, and gradually built up one of the most effective mission stations throughout Africa. Therefore, it is most appropriate that there should be presented in her memory a baptismal font, a symbol of forgiving grace and the cleansing power of God's love, which is a bond that ties all Christians in one great brotherhood throughout the whole wide world. And to conclude, Susan changed and transformed many lives. The brave and dedicated manner in which she lived her life can serve as a role model for current and future generations. She did not let her humble beginnings limit her life, one that was dedicated to service, first to God and then to God's children. Susan was indeed a pioneer with an indomitable spirit, a woman of grace, gumption, and grit. And I have enjoyed getting to know her, and I hope that you have as well. And I would like to mention that her legacy continues to live on here with a scholarship in her name at Upper Iowa University. And I would like to thank some of you in the audience who've helped me. Jean Martin, I've mentioned Becky, and Bonnie Timmerman and her husband Don, Vera Splinter, and my apologies to anybody else. Well, Christy Dennis and David have helped, but I do apologize to anyone else who I may have omitted. And I'd like to thank also the United Methodist Women of Fayette, who contributed pins when I went to Africa last year, and they have been distributed throughout Zimbabwe. Thank you so much, and I will answer questions. So, are there any questions? If not, I'll talk to you privately. Yes?
Did you say that you were looking for a publisher for your book?
I am. I'm really hoping to. It will be the United Methodist Publishing House. I have written my query letter and my proposal. I haven't sent it. I'm having someone who's worked there previously review it, so I have a good shot at it. But I'm hoping that it will be accepted, because it would be a good study book for United Methodist women in the future, I think.
So we can keep looking for it.
Keep looking. I'm really ready to be done. I've been doing this for 10 years, but I keep finding new things. Any other questions? I probably went over time a little, and I apologize for that. I really could have talked for many more hours.